Hello YouTube, and welcome to my B&B Forges hashtag 2020 Toilet Paper Railroad Spike Apocalyptic Challenge submission. My name is Kevin, and this is a bit of a departure from my normal videos, but in these crazy days I thought I'd have a little bit of fun. I am coming to you from Memphis, Tennessee, and I am going to try and build a railroad spike flanged mace. The plan is fairly simple. I'm going to take the 4 railroad spikes you see on my anvil and forge weld them together, and then forge weld that to the piece of rebar you saw standing up. So for starters, I'm going to flatten out the heads on the railroad spikes so that I'm able to put them back to back for eventual forge welding. I am not the best welder in general. I am not the best forge welder, but this is supposed to be a learning experience, right? What could possibly go wrong? I am an amateur blacksmith and have been doing this for about the last year and a half, most recently, but had previously done some blacksmithing back in the early 90s. I currently work at my local makerspace, Mid-South Makers, and when I started blacksmithing, they had neither a forge nor an anvil. And so I took it upon myself to build all of the equipment that I needed. The anvil is homemade. It's more of an anvil-shaped object than a true anvil, especially since it is not hardened steel. It is made of a series of plates that I found at the junkyard and was able to weld together. And the forge is actually the second forge I ended up building. The first one was a propane forge, but unfortunately I was not able to get it hot enough to ever forge weld. And so the forge you see in the background is my Frankenforge, made up of random scrap material that I found at the local junkyard, bits and pieces of angle iron, square tube, and the bottom is actually a piece of diamond plate that had been somewhat badly bent and dented, and I was able to cut enough out of it to get a reasonably flat surface, but it's a little curved in some areas. So because I am not the best at forge welding and can't really do it on 2 free pieces, I ended up using a piece of square tubing to hold 2 of the railroad spikes back to back, and I have now successfully forge welded those 2 spikes together and will continue to consolidate that weld. After playing around for a little bit and trying to get the 3rd spike welded onto the first 2, I decided maybe this isn't the best way to spend my time, and I've now moved on to the handle. My goal is to try and upset the end of that piece of rebar so that there's a little bit of a swell at the butt end of the handle to help keep your hand from sliding off. Hey, I've got an idea. Why don't I use the hardy hold to hold the piece of rebar upright while I hit on it? That shouldn't go too badly. Murphy really was an optimist, wasn't he? So after calling it quits for the day at the forge, I went and welded those 2 additional railroad spikes onto the first 2 that had been successfully forge welded. And here I am trying to get them to forge weld together. But first I want to rearrange where the heads of the 2 spikes are a little bit. And yeah, I just broke that off. Well, I suppose on the plus side, I now have a flat surface that I can put back into the forge. So what you see me working on now with that piece of square tubing is an attempt to make a ring to hold the fourth railroad spike to the first three so that I can get that forge welded back on. And so the problem I'm having is that as the ring heats up, it is becoming loose and the railroad spike is not being held in place sufficiently. And so at this point, your eyes are not deceiving you. I managed to break off the third spike that had already been welded on while I was adjusting things and trying to get the 3 spikes to weld to the fourth spike. And so we pretty much took 2 steps back for the day. Oh well, what else is new? So I've gone and welded the 2 spikes back on after cleaning them up. And this time I've used much more aggressive welding than I did last time. Originally, I just tried to do a light tack, and that's when I managed to break the first one off. And so this time I made sure there was sufficient penetration that I could beat on the railroad spikes without having to worry about them breaking off. And so with a successful forge weld of the 4 railroad spikes together, I can now start worrying about putting the handle on by opening up the bottoms, drawing them out some, and getting them fitted up. Okie dokie. With some nice solid welds holding the 2 parts together, time to forge weld. And with some successful forge welds, I am now able to move on to the flanges before grabbing some dinner. It's now later in the evening. As you can see here, I am continuing to consolidate the forge weld of the handle to the head, and I'm working on shaping the flange area. So at this point, the flange area is all done. The handle is fairly solid. And the next thing to do tomorrow morning is to flare out and thin out the actual edges of the flanges. some final cleanup where the handle and the head have been forge welded together. And I'm also using some of the flux to help clean off some of the scale and other accumulated debris on the metal. So I know that this is a railroad spike with a lower carbon content. I am still going to sort of heat treat it. This is as much for the finish that the oil will give as really any kind of attempts at hardening it. And there you go. One railroad spike rebar apocalyptic mace. All it needs is a little bit of grinding to create an edge, and we should be set. Well, here goes nothing, right?